nice to meet you. Wonderful to be here. My first time in Croatia. What a wonderful place. I want to ask first, how many of you are developers? Oh, that's pretty much all of you. How many are web developers or sit with web applications? That's a lot as well. Wonderful. So, I'm super excited to be here. I'm from Netlify. I founded Netlify together with my co-founder, Matt Billman. And normally I get to talk more to a business audience about the nature of what we do, which is enabling this decoupled web and why they should be investing in this. But I was asked to come here and talk a little bit about Netlify and the story and the emergence of the decoupled web. It's not going to be as in-depth or technical as most of the other talks will be. But I thought, like, what was the main narrative here? What was the angle? And when you look at it, really is how web developers have gone from cutting out Photoshop files and turning it into HTML to indeed becoming full-fledged application developers, right? I mean, like, it's absolutely insane what you can do as a web developer today compared to just a decade ago. A quick intro. My name is Chris, again. I do a lot of investing as an angel investor as well in our ecosystem. I sit on a number of advisory boards and executive boards today. I run our innovation fund. I sit in Bach Alliance, which is the industry body for what we all do when we work with composable and headless architectures, but more sort of catering the enterprises. And I created the first hybrid flash video company almost 20 years ago, back in Denmark. So I started my career doing a lot of extremely poor performing, huge flash sites with 90-second preloaders. It was so much fun, and it gave these rich media experiences. Of course, it was not very performant, so we moved on from that. Besides that, I love old movies, modern jazz, composable digital experiences, of course, a very big part of my life. All right, so a trip down memory lane. We used to cut out Photoshop files and turn it into HTML. This is where we came from. When we, in 2013, started Netlify, we were looking at developers starting to really evolve. Like, we got the early use cases of Angular. They were starting to build out applications. I mean, compiling things, as crazy as it sounds today, was completely unheard of back then for front-end developers. But it was really starting to happen. And it was interesting, right? But there was sort of still left to having to hand things over for implementation. And the reality is that 10 years ago, the web was actually challenged as a standard. There were, every day, you would see articles on, is it all going to be Instagram? Is it all, like, in 2-3 years, are we just going to look at apps instead of websites? And there were a lot of reasons for that, right? Performance was an issue. Security, you had these huge monolithic service areas, always exposed, always running and building for every single visitor. And scalability issues as well. Every time at that point, I mean, I'm talking 3-4 times a week, you have someone come on Hacker News, for example, right? And then they get there 15 minutes, and it's a bunch of 502s. It wouldn't scale very well. And that's simply because everything had to run off a server, and you're 2 people, right? You're getting going, and you're just spinning up something really quickly. You can't handle real traffic because you don't have the money for it. So there really was a lot of challenges there, right? And an example here of when the web really lost out was when Steve Jobs presented the iPhone for the very first time. That was as a PDF, right? So, of course, it had a picture of the iPhone, and all those icons of apps were not icons for apps at all. They were shortcuts to websites. But then we collectively found out that pulling in the UI every time you turn a page was not going to scale. It was simply not performant enough. The phones weren't fast enough, broadband weren't fast enough. It opened the door, of course, for apps, but that's a very gatekeep thing, right? I mean, it's great for one company, but it's not so good for the web, right? So it was a real challenge, right? And what Matt and I started to talk about was that at the core of this was this legacy digital experience, right? So the reason here was basically that the web was still a monolith, right? So for anyone here, and there's only a few of you that isn't a developer, all that means is that you had a single large piece of software running on a single server building for every single visitor. And it also meant that the need of a marketing coordinator, right? Because you're all web developers here, but very often you don't get to choose the applications that you work on, right? And so back here, you would have someone that needs to update content, right? Just super simple content management. And that led to choosing something, let's say, like WordPress. But that also meant, in turn, choosing a template engine and server environments, glue code, build tools, right? All of that was decided. So whether you like it or not, you're working in PHP. Yeah, right, that was painful. So even though the developer had started to be able to build up more advanced front-end applications, it still had to be handed over. So we thought, what if we take the basic premise of what had happened on mobile with the apps, where the app is downloaded separately from the data exchange afterwards, and decouple the web. And so this is a sort of a simplified version of what it looked like before and what it could look like now. Very essential in this was distributed computing. So this notion of pre-built the shell, pre-built the site to the extent that you don't have to have an extra round trip to the origin server. Use the browser as a runtime, right? And then we'd already see how we can wrap around these early APIs and third-party services. And all the right ingredients were actually there, right? When Matt started, he was already in San Francisco at that point with a fully proprietary, fully hosted, essentially WordPress. They were selling that to agencies. And when he started out, just a few years before, the #1 feature request was FTP access. And now it was, of course, all about Git, right? The browser had gone from being a document viewer to being a full-fledged operating system. JavaScript had not only won out and become a standard, the standard, enough to bet a business and a trend on, but also it had become really mature, right? We had the SAC generators, we had the API economy. It was all ready. We were good to go. And so what I got so excited about was how much this decoupling, this seemingly technicality of separating the front end from the back end, of separating the building from the hosting, could do. So first of all, it enables multiple points of origin, right? So you pre-render something, therefore you don't have an issue with sync across your different nodes across the world, so now you can have multiple points of origin. So now you're always close by, and you don't have to compute in the same way for every visitor. That makes it a lot faster, it makes it a lot more scalable, and of course, 97% of malware is automated scripts targeting large service monolithic areas of attack. They became an issue on your developer's computer and not the live production site that's faced for everyone. #2 is, of course, the huge one, right? Which is front-end developers who gain superpowers. And I spent all those years in agencies, and where we had control was the strategy, the communication, the design, and developing the front end. Where we lost control was when it was handed off for implementation. You create some tickets, it comes back a few months later, it doesn't look like you sent over, and there you go, back and forth, back and forth. But now you would flip it, right? All that backend would just be accessible as headless APIs. That would be sent to you rather than vice versa. And that just opened up all the doors, right? Now, instead of being dependent on system administrators and DevOps and infrastructure engineering and varnish caching and all those things, you could just publish directly yourself. And of course, lastly, that composable solutions with best-in-class components would be viable at length. Which would be really significant for enterprises, and I'll get back to that. But two things were needed, right? First of all, an ecosystem of headless services. So in essence, when we started, there was not a single headless API for e-commerce. So there's no retail, because all the commerce providers were monoliths, right? So we started with a lot of blogs. But we also needed a viable workflow. So once WordPress, to take that example, isn't all those things, but it's just what it does best, content management as a headless API. How does everything interconnect? How does it actually is compiled into one solution? How is it distributed? How does all this work? So there were so many pieces that had to be tied together. The Git workflow, the frameworks, the runtime build tooling, monitoring. There were so many considerations, right? And we tried without this. And as much as we loved the results of something that was lightweight and fast, there was just no viable way to scale it outside of a blog. There was also really complex infrastructure to manage, right? And with you needed CDCI pipes, you have the developer service, the staging environments. There was all these different things, and now you're of course dealing with something that was quite complex at the time, which is caching on content delivery networks. So what we tried to do and help the developer with was saying, okay, our role in this will be to create this front-end cloud. Essentially a place that you can connect all your tools to, where we can then build source really fast sites and apps, and then you can run it from the edge. And that was sort of the clean mission from the very beginning. And then we were sort of crossing our fingers and hoping that the world would follow, that it would grow to more than build, blogs and so on. And so the category back then was Jamstack, right? A term we coined, and the category was launched. And if we jump till today, it really happened, right? I was just catching up with Ghana, and they were talking about at least 2,500 companies in the category from just a couple back then. And it's not just new native players in this space, of which there's tons of. It's also a lot of the legacy players have seen themselves, even the ones that just focused on the enterprises at the very largest of scales, have found themselves compelled to have to push towards composable architecture, push towards this headless thing, because otherwise they would be seen as dinosaurs. So it's really, really happening at scale, which is wonderful, right? And the front-end cloud has really emerged, right? I mean, if you think about something like deploy previews and serverless push via Git, things we came out with along the day, that's just industry standard, right? It's table stakes. That's just how things are done today, right? So things have really changed. And just by our numbers alone, and that's just counting Netlify numbers, we have more than 4 million developers and businesses that built more than 34 million sites, stores, and apps. And so what actually happened today is that Jamstack has almost outlived itself. It's just the way we built, right? We've separated those notions. The front end is now seen in almost all new cases, especially if it's done greenfield, as separate. And if we go to the enterprises today, they'll talk of composable architecture. And that is really exploding into enterprises. So if you go to Gartner, for example, I find this really interesting because, of course, they're not going to be first movers. Those are developers. But once there has application within the enterprises, they'll start coming along. In 2020, 3 years ago, 12% said that if they're building out their DXPs or marketing clouds today, it would be composable. But what the numbers hide is that the life cycles of those monoliths, because they're so big and because they cost so much money and because it takes so long time to implement, is 7 to 10 years. So if we're being generous, the real number here is 1 to 2%. Now jump till today. In January 2023, which is already 9 months ago, Gartner, the largest analyst company in the world, said that 70% of all enterprises will be building with this technology. So now it's like a hockey stick, right? Which is super interesting. And we also see it with all kinds of different companies that we're building with, right? Close to 50% of the Fortune 500 already. And we have an enterprise focus in general, right? And just in looking at compliance and enterprise and partner support, sales motions, and all that. So that also helped us in regulated industries like financial, insurance services, stuff like that. But we also have, tech companies and fashion companies. So who are the early movers if you're looking to those companies? Well, a common thing amongst them is that developer velocity. So being able to quickly and frequently ship front-end code. They have to push to production from one time per week, and that's actually the average for enterprise clients before they start with us, is once a week they push to production, which, by the way, is like hugely better than the average every 3 months that it used to be not many years ago. On us, it's the average actually 20 times per day. Now that's of course not because we're 150 times faster software, not even a little bit, but it's because of the automation. It's because you're not actually depending on DevOps and system administration and caching and all those things. All of that is not a managed service by anyone. It's abstracted away. It's infrastructure turned into code. And so we see that a lot, right? Right. And so looking a little bit about why enterprises are adopting it. Now, I know you're a developer audience, but many of you also want to use the newest and coolest tools. And very often that can be sort of hard to convince upstairs of what is the business impact. And so in my work over the last years, and working with so many, I've sort of conduced this and boiled it into these top 7 reasons, which is faster time to market. That is a huge one. It counts for most CMOs much higher than reliability and uptime. Not that that's not important, of course that's table stakes, but it's so important, right? Reduce costs. This notion of only buying what I want. I don't want a huge monolith with 27 services if I only need 4 of them. More flexibility, that goes for omnichannel as well. This notion of being able to cater each digital touch point natively rather than having to be compromised by finding some in-the-middle solution from a monolith. But very much also this notion that you can have interchangeability. All of them have said, we need new analytics, but in order to do that, we have to change everything else. It's too expensive, it'll take too long. This notion that you can just take your payment system and decouple it and put in something else without changing everything else, it's a huge one, right? The higher conversion rates are simply because the sites are faster. Back to my original points, right? The security and scalability are the same reasons. So, these are just a few slides. There's so many case studies out there. We have a ton of them. We'll send them out if anyone wants to shop these to someone to try to convince them. Yeah, Pan Macmillan was one that had 8 times faster site improvements because the front-end teams were finally able to follow best practices, because they didn't have to compromise the implementation, because they could build freely, choosing the tools that they wanted. That's the actual impact. That's the business impact. That is huge. They go from breaking even to being much more profitable. And Spring, for example, they had 16-day build times because they had 12 million e-commerce storefront. Now that's 3 minutes. So it matters. It truly matters. It's not just to make a developer happy, right? It's that today most business problems have digital solutions, and catering developer productivity is probably the #1 way to increase efficiency and gain more revenue. All right, so what we're also seeing with those numbers that I showed before is this is actually, from a very practical point of view, the biggest shift since on-prem to cloud. So all of these things, they gradually develop, and then you have these step changes. But in this, I find it really interesting because we went to the cloud for 2 reasons: scalability and multitude of services. But it was always considered operations as usual, right? That infrastructure a cloud provider does not actually build anything on the infrastructure they provide. That's what you do. So you run it and maintain it. I was just speaking with a large governmental agency, and they had a $1 billion budget on IT and digital a year. 650 million is spent euro a year on keeping the lights on. I mean, it's insane, right? But that's the reality for so many. And this is what I'm seeing, and also to continue Swick's talk from a little earlier, right? Where AI and so on is really playing a very big role. But that's what we have to abstract away. That's what's happening now. So instead of saying, okay, how can we optimize, for our infrastructure engineers and make it even easier to set varnish caching? Don't have varnish caching. It's not that you have someone else set it, it's that you don't need to, right? Abstract that away. So the notion here is to take that operation and then abstract it away. No enterprises, at least in a few years, I hope, will be building these things themselves. Of course, there's going to be exceptions. In some things, it's a longer timeline than others. But when it comes to digital properties, site stores, and apps, you should not, as an enterprise, be maintaining your own clouds in that way. Rather, you should use a layer on top of it that's much more orchestrated around orchestration and workflows, so you develop rather than run and maintain. So what's next? And that's where I want to end up on here. These are, of course, just my meandering thoughts, right? And of course, this is much more high level than a lot of the other talks and what Swix was just diving into. But I have a few headlines that I see coming out that are very sort of, here. What is next is more superpowers, right? The enablement of the web developer is only going to continue. Now, one of the things that I'm really excited about, and this is not something that you have to re-educate yourself from, this is not something that's hyper complex where you need a new title and everything else. This is just for web developers, but backend as a service. There's tons of interesting plays out there like GraphBase and SATA.io and Chisel Strike and Convex and a bunch of others as well. Really, really exciting stuff. But the idea here is that serverless functions chip the way of when we needed a database, when we needed to tap someone on the shoulder as a web developer before, so we can get further. Backend as a service just takes that bar and lifts it tremendously. The notion here is that with JavaScript, with TypeScript, you can really, really push the envelope for what you can build as a web developer. And think of it, right? Today, it's no biggie doing like advanced redirects, language-based redirects on an edge node, right? That was completely reserved for an infrastructure engineer just a few years ago. Now it's a line of JavaScript in a Git repo together with the rest of the site, right? And so that journey just continues. And I really think backend as a service is something that we're going to talk a lot more about. I know that there's always some super hype. It was Web3 and blockchain, and now it's AI. But from a very practical point of view, I think this is it. And in all of these solutions, that's where the AI will play into it, right? But as a category outside of that, I think backend as a service is one. Distribution is another thing. That's something that if you're looking at is going on more and more and more. So the idea that we started with saying, let's push as much as we can to the edge, only continues, right? We're super excited to be able to provide more and more compute functionality on the edge, but also better database storage locally with people. This notion that you're not depending on a single point of origin and just pushing the envelope of that is just going to continue. And lots of exciting stuff coming out with that as well. And also, there's going to be a lot of AI functionality that will run on the edge as well. So that's going to be fantastic. And then I think design as code. I figured I'd include that one. It might be a spicy take, but I think what we're going to see in the next few years is, and I'm advising a company right now that works on called Animap, and they work on taking Figma and converting it directly into code automatically, right? What I really think is going to happen soon is this: we're going to see a merger of those. We're going to see Figma as code. Right? I think that we're going to see either from them or from somewhere else. I don't know where it's going to come from, but I do think that being able to bring design and designers much further into the process because it's natively code, not in a translated way, that is going to happen. And then I'll leave you on a spicy take here. I think AI is of course going to play a huge role, but for me, AI is again, in a very pragmatic way, and I know Swix can give so much more color to it as he just did, but what it really is abstraction. It's the same as I've been talking about for the last almost 27 minutes, which is taking something manual and automating it away. And I think, especially when we talk about the web, I think this is going to happen there first, because those frameworks that we work with, the output is CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, is a place where we're used to incredible iteration. There's no other group of developers in my world, in my opinion, that is as adaptable to change, that are as good as iterating as you all. Web developers have always gone like, you wake up one morning and all of a sudden it's a, it's a different framework, right? And you have to get used to that. And things change so rapidly. And I really think that together with this design as code and AI, I think front-end frameworks are going to change tremendously. I actually think that, and this is the spicy take, that today's front-end frameworks will be what jQuery is today already in a few years. I think that's going to change tremendously. But I'm super confident that web developers will only take advantage of this and only use it to do even more cool stuff. And then, I guess maybe, just maybe, with all this information, we will finally see the replacement of Flash, right? I miss those rich media. I know that it was not performant, and it wasn't secure, and we were right to move off it, but I miss those, video-born sites where the video is not just in a YouTube player, right? I miss the animations that you could do, because you could enable motion graphic artists that couldn't code, right? But they could keynote as they knew how to in After Effects and so on. So my wish is that someone here hears this and goes and makes the next Flash, but in a performant, modern way. At least that would make an old man very happy. And with that, I thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being with me on this journey